All right, day 13, restricted domains. Remember, there are two math rules that we cannot break. You cannot divide by a zero, so you cannot have a fraction with a zero below, and you cannot have a negative underneath a radical, but only the even roots. If it's odd roots, you can have a negative underneath. So like this one is the square root, so it's a 2, or the fourth root, or sixth root. So only even roots, you cannot have a negative underneath. So to find the largest possible domain, we're going to start with all real numbers and eliminate numbers that make the denominator equal to 0 or makes the square roots negative. So looking at number 1, we're going to find the domain. So remember, domain is all the x values that we're allowed to plug in. So you need to think, what makes this fraction undefined? What makes this bottom equal 0? So remember what we did before. We cannot have x minus 3 equals 0, because that makes that undefined. So what can x not be? Right, 3, because you're going to add 3 to both sides. So x cannot be 3. And remember, domain is talking about your x values. So your domain is all your reals except what? Right, 3. So all your reals except for it can't be 3 because it would make that fraction undefined. So if we do it in interval notation, remember from Friday when we did infinity, it's soft when you start with infinity. So negative infinity, now where can we go? To 3. Now it can't be 3, so it's a soft parentheses again. It's not a bracket. Or it can be 3 to what? Infinity. So either one of these. So it's this or this. This is interval notation written that way. But either one is correct. You can write all reals except for 3 or write it in interval notation. So let's try another one. Again, we need to find the domain. So we need to figure out what can it be. Well, we have x plus 3 cannot equal 0 because we can't have 0 on the bottom. So what can x not be this time? Right. Negative 3. So what is our domain? Our domain is the set of reals except for what? Good. Negative 3. So these are called restricted domains because there's two rules that they can't be. So let's try the third one. Again, it's still a fraction, so we can't have a 0 on the bottom. So x squared plus x minus 6 cannot be 0. Well, let's solve for x. How do we solve this when it's an x squared? Right, we're going to factor two numbers that multiply to give me a negative 6, but add up to a positive 1. So it's plus 3 minus 2. Good. Solve for x still. X plus 3, remember, cannot equal 0. But we're just solving, so it doesn't subtract 3. So x cannot be negative 3. And x can't what? Be 2. So, what is our domain? Our domain is the set of reals except for what? Negative 3 and 2. Good. Okay, now let's go on to square roots. Still restricted domain because you cannot have a negative underneath an even root. And this is a square root. So remember, technically there's a 2 out here that you don't see. That's what's considered an even root or a fourth root. So you cannot have a negative. So if you can't have a negative underneath the radical, it has to what be then? It has to be greater than or equal to what? 0. because it cannot be a negative. So that's how you're going to figure out where it's restricted. So you're going to take whatever's underneath the radical, and it has to be greater than or equal to 0, because it cannot be a negative. So it cannot be less than 0. And then you're going to solve it. Add 2. So x is greater than or equal to 2. So that is your domain. It can only be x is greater than or equal to 2. And you can graph that on your calculator and look to see that the x values are either 2 or beyond. Now if we wrote it in interval notation, interval notation, what is our low? What is the low that it can be? 2. And it can be equal to 2, so it's a bracket. What is the highest that it can go? Right, all the way to infinity. And remember, infinity is soft brackets. So let's look at number 5. Same thing, underneath the radical of an even root, it has to be greater than or equal to 0. So 10 minus 2x has to be greater than or equal to 0. And now you're just going to solve for x. Subtract 10. So we're left with negative 2x is greater than or equal to negative 10. Now what happens when you divide by a negative? Correct, your sign changes. Negative 10 divided by negative 2 is 5. So that is your domain. X is less than or equal to 5. Interval notation. What is my lowest? And if it's less than, it's going to be negative infinity. Now remember, infinity is always soft. What is my highest that it can be? 5. Can it be 5? Yes, so it's hard bracket. So these are restricted domains. It's with your even roots of your radicals and your fractions. So that's why it's called restricted domain. So now I'm going to give you 2 questions to try. So pause the video, see if you can find the domain of these 2 questions, and then turn it back on to check your answer. All right, now look over your answers. The domains are pretty easy. Now for the range, since they're asking you for the range, I would suggest, sorry about that, I would suggest using your calculator. Now when you type in the first one, your range is hard to tell. But check it out and see if you can see on the x line why x can equal 5 or negative 3. When you type in the second one onto your calculator, you should be able to tell me that the range is y is greater than or equal to 0.